There is no deal. Order in the court!
You are looking at a man who spent 30 years waking up before the sun, who laid brick after brick, who bled his fingers to pay for school tuition, and who, on that day, was sitting in a courtroom, being sued by the two boys he pulled off the street. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to go back 32 years, to a small town in rural Georgia, to a dirt road, and to a man who never asked anything from anyone. Vernon Hayes was 39 years old when this story began. No wife, no children, a two-bedroom apartment, a toolbox, and a bank account that barely closed at the end of the month. Every day, 6 in the morning, leather boots, work gloves, tool belt, and the 15-minute walk to the site on Caldwell Street, where a construction company was building a building he would never be able to afford to live in. Vernon liked the work. He didn't romanticize it, didn't think it was beautiful, but he liked the concrete that held firm, the wall that stood, being able to look at something at the end of the day and say, I built that. That was his life. Simple, quiet, no surprises. Until Wednesday, August 14th, 1991. Vernon was walking home from the site, his shirt soaked through with sweat, a plastic bag with 2 loaves of bread, a can of beans, and a soda. He turned the corner onto Pine Street and saw the ambulance lights. The accident had happened 30 minutes before, a truck with no brakes, and the car belonging to the Whitfields, Robert and Clara Whitfield, who lived 3 houses down from Vernon's apartment. Both of them were gone before the ambulance arrived. Vernon knew Robert from occasional work. They weren't close friends, the kind of neighbours who wave from the porch, who borrow a tool and return it the same day. Good people, simple people. What Vernon didn't know yet, standing on that sidewalk staring at the broken glass in the road, was that Robert and Clara had 2 sons. The social worker called Vernon because he was the only neighbour who had given his full name. She needed someone who knew the family. She needed a quick answer. And Vernon just went there to help, however he could. But when he walked into that room and saw the 2 boys sitting on a plastic bench, he stopped. Daniel was 10 years old. Marcus was 6. Daniel was holding his brother's hand so tight his knuckles had gone white. Marcus wasn't crying, he just stared at the door, like he was still waiting for someone to walk through it. The social worker explained the situation. No close relatives identified, no grandparents in the state, temporary foster care already in motion, 2 placements available, in different cities. The boys would be separated by morning. Vernon looked at the 2 of them, and the social worker asked if he had any information about the family. He told her no, that Robert never talked much about relatives. She started explaining the protocol, and that's when Vernon stopped her. They're going to different places. She paused and said yes. Vernon didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked how long a temporary guardianship would take. The social worker looked up from her papers. She asked if he lived alone, if he had steady income. He told her he had a steady job, his own apartment, 2 bedrooms. She told him it was a process, home visits, interviews, background checks. Vernon asked again how long, and something in the way he asked it, standing there in his work shirt still dusty from the site, plastic bag still in his hand, made her stop and really look at him. That night, with a provisional emergency authorization that the social worker, God bless her, managed to sign in 40 minutes, Vernon took the 2 boys to the apartment at 14 Caldwell Street. 2nd floor. Wooden staircase that creaked on the 3rd step. He didn't have a spare bed. He had a 2-seat couch and a floor mattress he used when he stayed too late at the site. He opened the upstairs room, the smaller one, laid the mattress on the floor and put out what bedding he had. 2 sheets and a thick blanket his mother had left behind years ago. It was almost 10 at night. Vernon heated the canned beans, cut both loaves of bread in half, and the three of them sat at a kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. Nobody said anything for a long time. Marcus was pushing the beans around with his spoon without eating. Then Daniel, without looking up, asked if Vernon had known their father. Vernon told him yes, that his father was a good man. A few seconds passed. Then Daniel asked why Vernon had come to get them. Vernon set his spoon down on the table, thought for a second, and said, "Because somebody had to." Daniel looked at him for the first time. Vernon noticed Marcus still hadn't touched his food. He asked quietly if the boy was hungry. Marcus shook his head. Vernon told him that was fine. He didn't have to eat. And then Marcus, almost in a whisper, said that his mother always left the hallway light on at night. Vernon looked at him and said, "I do too." There was no solemn promise that night, no speech. Vernon Hayes was not a man for speeches, but while he washed the 3 plates in the sink at 11 o'clock and listened to the sound of the 2 boys settling in upstairs, he already knew that something had changed and that there was no going back. The following week, Vernon arrived at the site an hour early. He asked his foreman for overtime, and on the way home, he stopped at the used furniture store on Main Street and bought a single bed. It cost $68, which he didn't have. He put it on a 4-installment plan, but that was just the beginning, because raising 2 boys who weren't yours, on a bricklayer's wage, in a town that didn't forgive weakness, was going to cost a lot more than $68. In the next part, you'll see exactly how much. Time doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock on the door. It just shows up one morning in the mirror, in the way your back takes a little longer to straighten, in the way your hands hurt before the rain even arrives. For Vernon Hayes, time showed up in layers, like coats of paint on an old wall. Each year a little heavier than the last. Daniel was 12. Marcus was 8. They had been living with Vernon for 2 years. The provisional guardianship had become permanent 6 months in. Not without paperwork, not without 3 home visits and 2 interviews where Vernon sat across from a caseworker in his cleanest shirt and answered every question quietly and completely. The apartment was the same. The table still wobbled. The staircase still creaked on the 3rd step. But there were drawings on the refrigerator now, and 2 pairs of sneakers by the door that weren't his. Vernon had worked out a system. Monday through Friday, he was on site by 6, back by 5:30, dinner on the table by 6:15, beans, rice, whatever protein was on sale that week, homework at the kitchen table while he washed the dishes, lights out at 9 for Marcus, 9:30 for Daniel. Then Vernon would sit in the chair by the window, the one with the torn armrest, and go through the week's expenses on the back of a paper bag. Rent, utilities, food, school supplies, always in that order, and whatever was left, if anything was left, went into the coffee tin on top of the refrigerator. The one labelled, in Vernon's handwriting, college. There were months when nothing went in the tin. There were months when Vernon took something out, and there were months, more than he'd like to remember, when he stood in the pharmacy aisle and put the bottle of anti-inflammatories back on the shelf, because Daniel needed new school shoes, and the ones he had were letting in water. In the spring of 1995, Marcus came home with a notice from school, a 3-day science trip to the Chattahoochee Nature Center, $85, due in 2 weeks. Marcus handed it to Vernon without saying much. He was 10 years old and already knew how to read the silence in that apartment. Vernon looked at the paper, set it face down on the table, and told Marcus to go wash up for dinner. That night, after the boys were in bed, Vernon sat with the paper again. He opened the coffee tin, counted what was inside. $62. He closed it, sat there for a while, then opened the drawer, found an envelope, and wrote Marcus's name on it. He made up the difference by skipping lunch for 11 days. A thermos of water and whatever was left from the boys' breakfast. His foreman noticed on day 4 and asked if everything was all right. Vernon said he was watching his weight. The foreman laughed. Vernon smiled and picked up his trowel. Marcus came back from that trip with a hand-drawn map of river ecosystems and a plastic bag of rocks he'd collected. He laid them out on the kitchen table and named every single one. Vernon listened to every word and didn't say a thing about the 11 lunches. The boys grew. That's what boys do. And with the growing came the world outside. Friends, opinions, the slow, brutal awareness of what you have and what you don't. Daniel was 15 when it started. Not a dramatic change. No single moment you could point to and say, there. More like a door that opens gradually. So gradually you almost don't notice until the draft is already in the room. Vernon had gotten off early that day, a concrete pour that finished ahead of schedule. So instead of waiting at home, he drove to the school, still in his work clothes, cement dust on his forearms, a dried streak of mortar on his left boot he hadn't noticed. He stood by the truck, hands in his pockets, watching the doors, feeling for a moment like a regular father picking up his kid. He saw Daniel before Daniel saw him, walking out with 3 other boys, laughing at something, easy, relaxed, a version of Daniel that Vernon liked seeing. Then Daniel looked up, and the laugh stopped. It was fast, just a flicker, but Vernon saw it. The way Daniel's eyes moved from Vernon to his friends and back. The almost imperceptible hesitation before he walked over. The way he said, "Hey," instead of anything else. And the way his friends glanced at Vernon's clothes. Not long, not mean, just a glance, and then looked away. That evening, after dinner, Daniel came to the doorway of the kitchen. Vernon was at the sink. Daniel stood there for a moment and then said quietly that he'd rather Vernon didn't come to the school, that he could take the bus, that it wasn't a big deal. But maybe Vernon didn't need to come in his work clothes, because some of the guys, they'd been saying things. Vernon turned off the faucet, dried his hands on the dish towel, and told Daniel, "All right, that was all. All right." And he folded the dish towel and set it on the counter and went and sat in the chair by the window, the one with the torn armrest. He didn't bring it up again, not that night, not ever. He stopped going to the school. He stopped wearing his work belt to the parent-teacher meetings. He started changing into a clean shirt in the truck. Before he went anywhere, the boys might be seen with him. Nobody asked him to do that last part. He just did it. And if that cost him something, if he lay awake that night staring at the ceiling with a particular kind of quiet in his chest, he never said so. Not to Daniel, not to anyone. Marcus was different, quieter than his brother, less concerned with what the boys at school thought, more interested in what was in the books. He had a memory that unsettled his teachers, the good kind of unsettled, the kind where they stay after class to ask how he did that. Vernon noticed early, the way Marcus finished his homework before dinner, the way he'd come to Vernon with questions that weren't in the assignment, just things he wanted to know, how concrete set, how rebar worked, why some buildings lasted and others didn't. Vernon answered everyone, slowly, carefully, like the answers mattered. Because to Marcus, they did. When Marcus was 14, his school counselor sent home a letter. Vernon read it twice at the kitchen table, then a third time. It said that Marcus showed exceptional academic aptitude, that with the right preparation, college wasn't just possible, it was likely. It recommended looking into academic programs and support options. Vernon folded the letter carefully and put it in the kitchen drawer, on top of the coffee tin receipt and the utility bills. And that night, he added $10 to the tin, which was 5 more than usual, and he stood there looking at it for a moment before he closed the lid. He started picking up weekend work, small jobs, patching driveways, repointing chimneys, whatever a man with a trowel and no complaints could find on a Saturday morning. He didn't tell the boys why. He just came home tired and counted the tin on Sunday nights. And if Daniel was going to college, Marcus was going to college. That was not a question Vernon entertained from any direction. Not the bank account, not the back pain, not the winter mornings when the cold got into his knuckles before 6 a.m. and stayed there until noon. Daniel left first, business administration at Georgia State. A partial scholarship, and the rest covered by the coffee tin, which Vernon had emptied completely for the first time in 8 years. He drove Daniel to the dorm in the truck, helped carry the boxes up, shook his hand at the door. Daniel hugged him, briefly, and said thanks. Vernon told him to call if he needed anything, and drove home alone. 3 hours on the highway, the passenger seat empty, the radio off. Marcus left 2 years later, pre-med at Emory, full academic scholarship. The morning he left, he stood in the kitchen for a long time, not saying much, just looking around at the apartment. The drawings long gone from the refrigerator, the sneakers by the door, his old ones, still there because Vernon hadn't moved them. Marcus picked up his bag, looked at Vernon, and said, "I'll pay you back, every cent." Vernon shook his head and said, "That's not what it was for." Vernon stood at the window and watched Marcus's car until it turned the corner. Then he went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, sat down at the table, the one that still wobbled. After all those years, still wobbled. And the apartment was very, very quiet. The coffee tin was empty. The chair by the window had a new tear in the armrest. And Vernon Hayes, 50 years old, alone, back aching from 30 years of brick and mortar, had just done the thing he set out to do. Both boys, both in college, both with a future he had built with his own hands, just like every wall he had ever raised. What he didn't know yet was what they were going to do with it. 10 years go by faster than you think, especially when you're spending them alone. Daniel opened a consulting firm in Atlanta, commercial real estate. The kind of business where men wear watches that cost more than Vernon made in a year. He was good at it. Sharp, well-dressed, confident in rooms that would have made the younger version of him feel small. He had an office on the 14th floor, a view of the city, a wife named Claire, and a house in Buckhead with a kitchen that had never once smelled like canned beans. Marcus became a doctor, internal medicine, practicing at a hospital in Charlotte. He was the kind of doctor patients trusted immediately. Calm, precise, thorough. The colleagues who knew his background called it remarkable. The ones who didn't just called him good at his job. He was good at his job. He had an apartment with high ceilings and a spare room he used as a study, full of the books he'd been collecting since he was 14. Some of them still had the library stickers on the spine, the ones Vernon had driven him to return on Saturday mornings. They called on birthdays, most years, Christmas, sometimes a card. Daniel visited twice between 2005 and 2011. Marcus 3 times. They were short visits. A meal, some conversation, the particular awkwardness of men who have grown into a life that no longer fits the room they're sitting in. Vernon would cook, whatever he had. The table still wobbled. Nobody fixed it. Vernon worked his last day on a site in November of 2013. He was 63 years old. His back had been giving him serious trouble for 2 years. His knees since longer than that. The foreman, a younger man now, someone who hadn't known Vernon in his prime, had been quietly reducing his hours for months. Not out of cruelty. Just practicality. A man who winces picking up a block is a liability on a commercial site. Vernon understood that. He'd been on the other side of that equation himself years ago. He cleaned out his locker. A pair of spare gloves. A photograph of Daniel and Marcus from maybe 1998, taped to the inside of the door, corners curled. A small pocket calendar from 2009 he'd never thrown out. He put it all in a plastic bag. shook the foreman's hand, and walked to the truck. 31 years. A plastic bag. His pension came to $940 a month. Rent was $680. He'd moved to a smaller place 3 years earlier, 1 bedroom, ground floor, easier on the knees. He budgeted the rest with the same discipline he'd always had. The same paper bags, the same order. Rent, utilities, food. No coffee tin this time. Nothing left to save for. In 1987, 4 years before the accident that would bring Daniel and Marcus into his life, Vernon had bought a piece of land, 2.5 acres in a rural patch outside Millhaven. Red clay soil, a few scrub pines, nothing on it. He paid $11,000. Took him 4 years to save it. The idea was simple. Someday he'd build something on it. A small house. Nothing grand. Just something that was his. Something permanent. The land sat there through the years while everything else changed. While the boys came. While the college tin filled and emptied. While the apartment got smaller. It just sat there. Patient. The way land is. The letter came in February. Vernon almost threw it away with the circulars. It was from the county assessor's office. A routine notice about a property tax reassessment. He opened it because he always opened official mail. Habit. And he sat down when he read the number. The state had approved a new highway interchange 2 miles from that patch of red clay. A distribution corridor. 3 logistics companies had already filed permits in the surrounding area. The land Vernon had bought for $11,000 in 1987 had been assessed at $412,000. Pending full development projections, a real estate broker's estimate put it closer to $600,000. Maybe more. Vernon read the letter 3 times, set it on the table, made himself a cup of coffee. Stood at the kitchen window for a while. He wasn't a man who celebrated prematurely. But for the first time in a long time, the arithmetic of the next few years looked different. A surgery he'd been putting off. A decent place to live. Maybe, for once, not counting what was left on a paper bag. He folded the letter carefully, put it in the drawer, and called a real estate attorney whose number he found in the local directory. He made one mistake. One. He told Daniel. It wasn't naive. It was instinct. The instinct of a man who had always believed that family, whatever shape it came in, deserved to know the important things. So he called Daniel on a Tuesday evening, told him about the letter, the reassessment, the highway, the number. He said he was thinking of selling, that he wanted to use the money to cover the surgery, stabilize his finances, maybe put something aside. He said it plainly, the way Vernon said everything. No drama. Just the facts. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said that sounded like a smart move. He said he'd look into it, just to make sure Vernon was getting the right advice. Not to worry, he'd handle it. Vernon thanked him and hung up, and sat there at the kitchen table feeling, for a brief moment, like maybe things were all right between them. He didn't know that Daniel had hung up the phone and immediately called Marcus. He didn't know that Daniel had a contact at a commercial real estate firm who confirmed the projections within 48 hours. He didn't know that by the end of that week, Daniel had spoken to an attorney. Not to help Vernon. To understand what it would take to challenge his legal capacity to manage the asset. The word they used was interdiction. A legal process by which a person can be declared mentally or physically unfit to manage their own affairs, their own property, their own decisions. Vernon was 63 years old. He had a bad back and worn-out knees. But his mind was as clear as it had ever been. That didn't matter as much as Daniel had hoped. But it wasn't going to stop him from trying. Marcus's role in all of this is harder to define. He didn't initiate it. He didn't draw up the legal strategy. But when Daniel called and explained what he was planning, Marcus didn't say stop. He asked questions. Practical questions. The kind that don't say yes out loud, but don't say no either. And sometimes, in a situation like this, silence is its own kind of answer. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in April. Vernon was in the kitchen. He'd been having a slow morning. The cough that had been building since winter was worse. And he'd slept badly. The doctor had mentioned the word silicosis at his last visit. Dust in the lungs. Decades of it. The surgery he'd been planning to pay for with the land sale was partly for that. A procedure that wouldn't fix it, nothing would fix it, but would slow it down. Give him more time. Better breathing. A few more years without the oxygen tank he could already see coming. He heard the mail slot. Didn't get up right away. Finished his coffee. Then walked to the door and picked up the stack. Electric bill. A circular. And a large envelope. Official, with the name of a law firm in the top left corner. Daniel's City, Atlanta. He opened it at the kitchen table. Read it slowly. The language was dense, legal, but he understood it. He'd lived long enough to understand things he never wanted to learn. The filing alleged that Vernon Hayes lacked sufficient cognitive and managerial capacity to make sound decisions regarding assets of significant value. It requested a court-ordered evaluation, and pending that evaluation, a temporary freeze on any sale or transfer of the property. The petitioners were listed at the bottom of the first page. Daniel R. Hayes. Marcus J. Hayes. Vernon set the papers down. Flat on the table. He didn't crumple them. Didn't stand up. Didn't make a sound. He just sat there. In the kitchen, with the electric bill and the circular. And his coffee gone cold. And the names of the two boys he had pulled off a plastic bench in a police station. 32 years ago, printed at the bottom of a legal document, designed to take everything he had left. The table wobbled slightly when he put his elbows on it. Same as it always had, after all these years. Still the same table, still the same wobble. And Vernon Hayes sat with his face in his hands and breathed. In, out, the way a man breathes, when he has nothing left to do but keep breathing. In the next part, the truth about Daniel and Marcus's past comes to light, a secret Vernon had been carrying alone for 30 years. And the courtroom where this all began is about to hear things that nobody in that room was ready for. The morning of the hearing, Vernon was up at 5. Not because he needed to be. Old habit. The body doesn't forget a schedule, even when the schedule is gone. He made coffee. Stood at the window. The same window he'd stood at for years. Different apartment, same position. Same light coming in at the same angle. He drank the coffee slowly. Then he went to the closet and took out the suit. It belonged to his neighbour Raymond, who was roughly the same height, but broader in the shoulders. Vernon had asked to borrow it 3 days earlier without explaining why. Raymond handed it over without asking. That's the kind of neighbour Raymond was. Vernon pressed it the night before. Laid it on the chair. And now he put it on, standing in front of the small mirror on the bathroom door. The jacket sat wrong across the back. He buttoned it anyway, picked up the folder from the kitchen table. Old manila, edges soft with age. He'd had it in the bottom drawer for 32 years. He put it under his arm and walked out. The courtroom wasn't large, but it felt large that morning. The way empty space feels larger when you're standing in it alone. Vernon sat at the respondent's table. He had a court-appointed advocate, a young woman named Priya, 2 years out of law school, who had reviewed the case twice the night before and told Vernon honestly that the filing was aggressive, but not airtight. He thanked her and set the folder on the table in front of him. She glanced at it, asked what was inside. Vernon said, "Everything." Across the aisle, Daniel sat between 2 attorneys in dark suits. He looked the way he always looked in professional settings. Composed. Prepared. He did not look at Vernon. Marcus sat 1 seat away from Daniel. He looked at the table. He had looked at the table since he walked in, and he had not looked up. Daniel's lead attorney opened. His name was Garrett, the kind of lawyer who speaks in complete sentences and never raises his voice, because he doesn't need to. He laid out the petitioner's case methodically. He submitted the medical records, the silicosis diagnosis, the treatment plan, the prognosis. He spoke carefully about cognitive risk in patients with chronic respiratory illness. He referenced Vernon's age, his limited income, his isolation. He said, with great respect for Mr. Hayes and everything he had provided for his clients over the years, that a man in his condition should not be making unilateral decisions about an asset valued at over $500,000. That it wasn't about the money. It was about protection. It was about family. Vernon listened to all of it without moving. His hands were flat on the table. Still. The way hands go still when a man has decided he's already said everything he needs to say and is just waiting for his turn. When the judge gave Vernon the floor, he stood slowly. The back. Always the back. He straightened, cleared his throat once, and spoke. He said he wasn't going to argue with the medical records. His lungs were damaged. That was true. He said he wasn't going to pretend he was the same man he was at 40. He wasn't. But he said that his memory was intact. And then he said something that made the room go quiet. He said he remembered the exact date he bought the land. March 9th, 1987. He remembered the amount, $11,000. He remembered that he had saved it over 4 years, putting aside what he could, and that the final payment cleared on a Friday. He remembered driving out to look at it that afternoon. 2.5 acres of red clay and scrub pine. Nothing on it. And thinking, this is mine. This is the first thing I ever owned outright. He said he also remembered every school year, every supply list, every pair of shoes. He said he wasn't reciting these things because he wanted anything back. He made that clear. He didn't want a cent returned. He said he was reciting them because if there was a question about whether his mind worked, he wanted the court to understand what his mind had been carrying for 32 years, and carrying just fine. Then he sat down, reached for the folder, and said, with the court's permission, he had some documents he'd like to submit. The judge said, "Proceed." And Vernon opened the folder for the first time in 32 years. The folder contained 4 things: a deed, 2 letters, and a receipt. The deed was for the land, but it wasn't just any deed. Attached to it was a separate document, a private agreement, handwritten and notarized, between Vernon Hayes and Robert Whitfield. Dated February 1987. 8 months before Vernon completed the purchase. The document was simple. Robert Whitfield had taken on a debt in the early 1980s. A business arrangement that had gone wrong. The kind of debt that didn't come from a bank. The kind that came with interest that compounded in ways no contract specified. By 1986, Robert owed more than he could pay. And the people he owed it to had started making their presence known. At his home. In front of his family. In front of his sons. Robert came to Vernon. Not as a close friend. As a neighbour. As a man with nowhere else to turn. He didn't ask for the money outright. He asked Vernon if he would be willing to purchase the land that Robert technically held a claim on through a family arrangement, at a price that would allow Robert to settle the debt and clear his name. Vernon would get the deed. Robert would get clean. And the boys, Daniel and Marcus, 4 and 8 years old at the time, would never know their father had been in that kind of trouble. The agreement stipulated one condition in Robert's own handwriting. If anything ever happens to me, and those boys need help, I'm asking you to remember this. Vernon had signed it, and he had remembered it. For 32 years. The second document was a letter, from Robert, written to Vernon sometime in 1989, 2 years before the accident. It thanked him. In the plain, unpracticed way, a man who doesn't write letters writes a letter. It said that the debt was settled, that his family was safe, that he didn't know how to repay Vernon and wasn't going to embarrass himself by pretending he did. It said, if you ever need anything, you know where I am. And it said, the boys don't know. I'd like to keep it that way. Vernon had honoured that. Every single day. For 25 years after Robert was gone. The third document was the receipt. From the debt settlement, in the amount of $9,400, paid in full, by Vernon Hayes, on behalf of Robert Whitfield. Dated March 1987. The same month, Vernon bought the land, with the same money, because there had only been one pool of money, and Vernon had used it for both. $11,000 for the deed, and $9,400, drawn from savings he had rebuilt over the following years, quietly, to close the account. He had never told anyone. Not a soul. The judge read the documents. Slowly. The courtroom was the quietest it had been all morning. Garrett, Daniel's attorney, leaned over to confer in a whisper. Daniel's face had changed. Something in the jaw. The way a composed face changes when the composure no longer has anything to stand on. Marcus looked up from the table for the first time. He read the document the judge's clerk passed to the petitioner's side. He read it once. Then he set it down, and he looked at Vernon. For the first time since walking into that room. For the first time, maybe, in longer than that. And Vernon looked back at him. The same way he had looked at a 6-year-old boy, staring at a police station door, waiting for someone to walk through it. Steady. Without accusation. Just, I see you. I'm still here. Marcus put his hand over his mouth. Said nothing. Looked back down at the document. His shoulders dropped in a way that had nothing to do with posture. The way a person's body responds. When something inside it gives. Daniel had gone very still. He was staring at the agreement. At his father's handwriting. Robert Whitfield. A signature he probably hadn't seen in over 20 years. The loops of the letters. The way his father had always pressed too hard with a pen. Daniel knew that handwriting. He had grown up with it on birthday cards and permission slips. And now it was here. In a courtroom. In a document that described a man desperately trying to protect his family. And another man quietly making that possible. Without telling anyone. Without asking for anything. Without ever once using it as leverage. Until today. When he had no choice. Vernon never used this secret as a weapon. Not when Daniel asked him not to come to the school. Not when the visits stopped. Not when the legal papers arrived. He carried it to protect a dead man's name. What does that say about who Vernon Hayes is? The judge, a woman named Honourable Christine Okafor, 21 years on the bench, set the documents down in front of her. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at both sides of the room. And she said she was going to take a brief recess to review the submitted materials. She said that when court reconvened, she expected all parties to be present and prepared for a full ruling. She said it without expression. The way judges say things when they have already made up their mind and are simply giving the room time to catch up. The gavel came down. One clean strike. The same sound that opened this story, and the room began to move around Vernon Hayes, while he sat very still. At his table, with the empty folder in front of him, and Raymond's jacket still sitting wrong across his shoulders, and his hands flat on the table, and his breathing slow and deliberate, because the lungs made it necessary, and because he had learned, a long time ago, that the only thing you can always do is keep going. In the final part of this story, the judge returns, and what she says will decide not just the land, but what 32 years of a man's life was actually worth. Stay with us. The recess lasted 19 minutes. Vernon sat at the table the entire time. Priya offered to get him water. He said he was fine. She sat beside him and reviewed her notes. Vernon looked at the far wall. There was a crack in the plaster, thin, running diagonally from the window frame. He found himself thinking about how he would fix it. Old habit. A man who has spent his life looking at walls never quite stops seeing what needs to be done to them. On the other side of the room, Daniel spoke to his attorneys in a low voice. Garrett was calm. Professional. Restructuring. That's what lawyers do in a recess. They restructure. Marcus had not spoken to anyone. He was still in his seat. Still looking at the document. Or maybe not looking at it anymore. Maybe just sitting with it. The way you sit with something when you finally understand what it actually is. The door to the judge's chamber opened. Everyone stood. The Honourable Christine Okafor walked to the bench. She sat. She set her reading glasses on her nose. And before she opened the folder in front of her, she looked up, not at the attorneys, not at the gallery. She looked at Daniel, then at Marcus. For a long moment. The kind of look that doesn't require a response. Because it isn't asking a question. It's making a statement. Then she opened the folder and began. She said the court had reviewed the submitted documentation in full. She said that the petitioners had filed under a statute designed to protect vulnerable individuals from financial exploitation. She said she found it significant, and she used that word twice, significant, that the documentation presented by the respondent today demonstrated not a diminished capacity for sound judgment, but rather an extraordinary one. She said that in 21 years on this bench, she had seen many financial disputes, contested wills, disputed assets, families divided by money. She said she had rarely, if ever, seen a man present a document proving that he had spent his life savings to protect the reputation of a dead man, so that 2 children would inherit a clean name, and then raise those same children, and then stand in a courtroom 30 years later and only reveal it because he had no other choice. She said, "The law concerns itself with contracts and legal capacity." She said, "This court concerns itself with facts, and the facts, as submitted today, are unambiguous." Vernon Hayes is in full possession of his mental faculties. He has demonstrated, across 3 decades of documented action, a capacity for long-term judgment that this court finds not only sufficient, but, frankly, rare. The petition for interdiction is denied, in full. The property known as the Caldwell Parcel, registered to Vernon Hayes since March of 1987, remains solely and entirely his. He may sell it, hold it, or do whatever he sees fit, without interference, without condition. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, 1 strike, and it was over. Daniel was out of his seat before the echo of the gavel finished. His attorneys gathered papers. Garrett said something about next steps, about options, about appeals. Daniel nodded but wasn't listening. He moved toward the door with the particular speed of a man who needs to be somewhere else before he has to look at anything else. He didn't look at Vernon. Not once. Not on the way out. Some things, when they break, don't break loudly. They just go quiet and stay that way. Marcus didn't follow his brother. He stood in the aisle for a moment. The attorneys moved around him. The gallery emptied. Vernon was putting the folder under his arm. He looked up, and Marcus, 42 years old, successful, composed in every professional setting he had ever entered, Marcus couldn't hold it. He said Vernon's name. Just that. 1 word, and his voice broke on it. He said he hadn't known. About Robert. About the debt. About what Vernon had done in 1987. He said if he had known. But he stopped himself there, because he was a man of precision. And he wasn't entirely sure that sentence ended the way he wanted it to. So he said, "I'm sorry. I should have said stop. I should have said no. I should have called you back every time I didn't." He said he had money. He wanted to pay for the treatment. All of it. Whatever the surgery cost. Whatever came after. He said Vernon shouldn't have to use the land money for that. That was his. Vernon had earned that a long time ago. Vernon looked at him for a moment. The boy who used to stare at the police station door, waiting for someone to walk through it. Now standing in a courthouse corridor, with his tie loosened and his eyes red, and 30 years of distance, trying to compress itself into a hallway conversation. Vernon reached out, put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, and said, quietly, "I never needed you to pay me back. I needed you to remember where you came from. That's all I ever needed." He gave the shoulder one firm press, the way you do when words have reached their limit, and then he let go, and walked toward the exit. Slow, steady. Raymond's jacket still sitting wrong across his back, the folder under his arm, and the door opening ahead of him into the afternoon light. "I never needed the money. I needed you to remember." What does that mean to you? Vernon sold the land in September of that year. $620,000. The closing took 40 minutes. He signed his name 3 times. The same signature he'd been writing since he was a young man. Nothing fancy. Just legible. Just his. He scheduled the surgery for November. The thoracic specialist in Macon explained what the procedure would and wouldn't do. It wouldn't reverse the scarring. 30 years of cement dust don't disappear in an operating room. But it would reduce the pressure, improve the airflow, give him better years. Not more years necessarily, but better. Vernon said that was enough. He meant it. He didn't buy a large house. He didn't buy a new truck. He found a small place on the east side of Millhaven. 3 rooms, a covered porch, a backyard with 2 oak trees and enough space for a garden. If he ever decided to start one, the realtor kept pointing out features, updated fixtures, new flooring. Vernon kept looking at the yard. He made an offer the same afternoon. The first thing he bought for the new house was a kitchen table, solid oak, 4 legs, all the same length. He set it in the center of the kitchen and pressed both hands flat on the surface. It didn't move. He stood there for a moment with his hands on that table. An old man in a quiet kitchen, in a house that was finally, completely his. And the table was perfectly still. After all those years, finally still. Vernon Hayes spent his whole life building things for other people. That's what the work was. You show up, you read the plans, you mix the mortar, you lay the brick. And when you're done, you pack up your tools and you walk away. And someone else moves into the thing you built and puts their name on the door. That's the deal. A bricklayer doesn't build for the credit. He builds because the wall needs to be built and because he knows how. But here is what I want you to understand about this man. The most important thing he ever built was never on any blueprint. It had no permits, no inspections, no property tax, no deed. What Vernon Hayes built, over 32 years in a wobbling apartment on Caldwell Street, was a life for 2 boys who had no one. He built it the same way he built everything else, brick by brick, without complaint, without an audience, without keeping score. There's a version of this story where Vernon is bitter, where the years of sacrifice turn into resentment, where the school corridor and the missed phone calls and the legal papers harden a man into someone he didn't used to be. That version of the story exists. It happens to real people. It's not a weakness. It's human. Vernon Hayes didn't go that way. Not because he was a saint. Not because he didn't feel it. He felt all of it. But somewhere along the line, he had made a decision, quiet, private, the way he made all his decisions. That what he had done was worth it, regardless of what came back. That the wall stands whether or not anyone thanks the man who laid it. That the work was the point. Marcus paid for the surgery. Vernon let him, not because he needed the money anymore, but because Marcus needed to do it. And Vernon understood the difference. The 2 of them talk on the phone now, not every week, but enough. Daniel is a harder road. Some distances close slowly. Some don't close at all. Vernon doesn't chase it. He plants things in the backyard. He sits on the porch in the evenings. He breathes better than he did a year ago. Not perfectly, but better. And the table in his kitchen doesn't wobble. For the first time in 32 years. It just holds. Exactly the way a good table should. Exactly the way a good man does.